The cold slap of silence hit me harder than the New York winter wind that afternoon. I stood frozen at the entrance of the grand ballroom, the same place my heart had invested $50,000, not in myself, but for my son's lavish wedding. And hearing his voice order security to keep her away from here crushed something inside me I didn't even know was still alive. The elegant marble floor beneath my feet suddenly felt like quicksand, swallowing every hope I'd carried for 32 years. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old. I live alone in my Upper West Side apartment, where the worn rose-scented curtains filter harsh city light, yet my spirit has been gray for longer than I care to remember. The lingering scent of that wedding night still haunts the air around me. Champagne bubbles that once sparkled with promise. Roasted chicken that fed hundreds of guests who never knew my name. Delicate pastries I helped choose but never tasted. Every morning I wake to these phantom smells, mocking reminders of my invisible presence at the most important day of my son's life. I had waited outside that ballroom for 3 hours that December evening. 3 hours in my best navy dress, the one I bought specifically for his wedding, spending money I could barely afford on something beautiful enough to make him proud. My hands shook as I clutched the folded invitation, the crisp paper still sharp despite the tears that had smudged my handwritten notes in the margins. Notes about what I wanted to say to him, about how proud I was, about how much I loved seeing him happy. Before the wedding, I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. I saw myself walking into that ballroom, seeing my son David in his perfectly fitted tuxedo, the one I helped pay for, turning toward me with that smile that used to light up our cramped Brooklyn apartment. I pictured his bride, Jessica, radiant in her designer gown, also partially funded by money from my retirement account, welcoming me with open arms. I dreamed of dancing with my granddaughter Lila, spinning her around while she giggled in her flower girl dress. But dreams, I've learned, can be the cruelest lies we tell ourselves. Instead, I came face to face with 2 security guards who looked at their clipboard and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're not on the list." When I explained I was the groom's mother, they radioed someone. That someone was my son. And through their earpiece, clear as the December air that stung my cheeks, I heard David's voice. "Yes, I see her. Keep her away from here. This is my day." The guards were kind enough in their rejection. They offered to call me a cab. They suggested I wait in the hotel lobby downstairs. But kindness from strangers couldn't soften the blade of my own son's words. I stood there for another hour, watching through the glass doors as guests laughed and danced, as my son lifted his bride, as my granddaughter Lila twirled in that precious yellow dress I'd bought her for the occasion. I watched my own family celebrate without me, and I felt something inside my chest crack open like ice breaking on the Hudson River. The invitation in my hands bore my name in elegant script. "Mr. and Mrs. David Richardson request the honor of your presence." But my presence, it seemed, was anything but an honor. It was a burden they no longer wanted to carry. That night, riding the subway back to my empty apartment, I stared at my reflection in the dark window and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. When did I become someone my own child wanted to hide from? This wasn't the first time I had sacrificed everything for this family. My entire adult life has been a series of compromises. A marathon of giving that never seemed to have a finish line. The pattern started so long ago I can barely remember when I first said yes when I should have said no. It began 45 years ago when I married David's father, Robert. We were young and broke, living in a studio apartment in Bushwick when Brooklyn wasn't the trendy borough it is today. When David was born, Robert worked construction, and I taught 3rd grade at PS 234. Our life was simple but full of love, or so I thought. When David turned 7, Robert announced he'd found someone else. Not with tears or apologies or explanations, just a note left on our kitchen table next to cold coffee and unpaid bills. "Margaret, I can't do this anymore. Take care of David. He needs you more than he needs me." 38 words to end 18 years of marriage and leave me with a 7-year-old boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I never gave David the letter. Instead, I told him his father had to work far away, that he still loved him very much, that sometimes grown-ups make difficult choices. I spent 2 years crafting elaborate stories about why Daddy couldn't visit, why he didn't call, why his birthday cards never came. I became a fiction writer of the cruelest kind, one who lies to protect her child's heart, while her own breaks a little more each day. Those early years as a single mother were a masterclass in sacrifice. I worked double shifts as a substitute teacher, picking up assignments at different schools across the borough, just to keep our one-bedroom apartment in Prospect Heights. David slept on the pull-out couch while I took the bedroom, but most nights I fell asleep at the kitchen table grading papers or planning lessons for the next day. When David wanted to play Little League, I found the registration fee by selling my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable thing I owned. When he outgrew his clothes every few months, I shopped at thrift stores and worked miracles with a sewing machine I bought secondhand. When he dreamed of summer camp with his friends, I took a weekend job cleaning office buildings in Manhattan, riding the subway at dawn while David slept, earning enough to send him away for 2 weeks of happiness I couldn't afford. "You never say no, do you, Mom?" he used to say, half teasing, half demanding, when he was 10 years old and wanted the newest video game system. He was right. I never said no. Not when he needed new sneakers every semester because his feet grew so fast. Not when his class went on field trips I couldn't afford. Not when he wanted guitar lessons, then quit after 3 weeks to try karate instead. I thought that's what good mothers did. I thought love was measured in how much you were willing to give up, how far you would stretch yourself, how many times you could say yes when your heart wanted to say, wait, or let's talk about this, or simply, I'm tired too. When David was 15, we moved to a smaller apartment to save money. He was angry about leaving his friends, angry about sharing a bathroom with the old man upstairs who played his television too loud. I absorbed his anger like a sponge, telling myself it was temporary, that teenage years were hard for everyone, that my job was to be his soft place to land no matter how roughly he fell. But anger, I learned, can become a habit. And habits, once formed, are hard to break. David's senior year of high school brought new challenges. He wanted to attend NYU for business school, a dream that carried a price tag of $60,000 a year. I had saved exactly $4,000 for his college education. The guidance counselor suggested community college first, then transferring. David looked at me across our tiny kitchen table and said, "Mom, you'll find a way. You always do." So I found a way. I took out loans against my teaching pension. I sold my car and took the subway everywhere. I moved to an even smaller apartment in Washington Heights, where the rent was cheaper but the commute to work was an hour each way. I picked up tutoring jobs 3 evenings a week and taught summer school every year. My life became a series of calculations. How much I could borrow, how much I could save, how many years I could work past retirement to pay it all back. David thrived at NYU. He joined a fraternity, made friends whose parents owned businesses, spent spring breaks in Miami and winter breaks in Aspen. When I asked him how he afforded these trips, he said his friends paid for him. "They know my situation, Mom. They're generous." I should have been suspicious, but I was proud. My son had friends who cared about him. He was living the life I dreamed of giving him. During his sophomore year, David called me at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. "Mom, I need $500 by tomorrow. There's been a misunderstanding with my housing deposit." I asked what kind of misunderstanding. He said it was complicated, something about roommate drama and paperwork. I didn't have $500, but I had a credit card with available space. The next morning, I went to the bank and got a cash advance, then took the subway down to his dormitory to deliver it personally. When I handed him the envelope, he barely looked at me. "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd come through." He didn't invite me to see his room or meet his friends or grab lunch together. He took the money and said he had to run to class. I rode the subway back to Washington Heights feeling hollow, like I'd just fed a machine that only knew how to take. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define our relationship for the next 15 years. David would call with emergencies, car repairs, security deposits, medical bills, credit card payments he couldn't make. Each time, I found a way to help. I borrowed against my retirement account, took second mortgages, worked summer jobs even after I qualified for vacation time. My financial advisor warned me I was headed for trouble, that I needed to save for my own future. But David was my future. He was my legacy, my purpose, the reason I got up every morning. When David graduated from NYU, he got a job at a marketing firm in Midtown. His starting salary was more than I'd ever made as a teacher, even after 30 years in the classroom. I thought the emergency calls would stop. I thought he'd finally become independent, maybe even offer to help me for once. Instead, the requests got bigger. He needed help with a car down payment because his credit wasn't established yet. He needed help with first month's rent and security deposit for an apartment in Murray Hill, because he deserved to live somewhere nice after all his hard work. He needed help buying professional clothes, a computer, furniture, a security deposit for utilities. "I'll pay you back, Mom," became his catchphrase. "Once I get established, I'll take care of you." I believed him because I needed to believe him. The alternative, that I had raised a son who saw me as an ATM instead of a mother, was too painful to consider. When David met Jessica at a company happy hour, he was 28, and finally seemed to be finding his footing. She was beautiful, ambitious, from a wealthy family on Long Island. Her father owned 3 car dealerships, and her mother was a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties. David would come to dinner at my apartment and tell me stories about Jessica's family's house in the Hamptons, their yearly trips to Europe, their casual conversations about investment portfolios and trust funds. "She's out of my league, Mom," he confided one evening, picking at the pasta salad I'd made with ingredients carefully chosen for maximum nutrition at minimum cost. "Her family has everything. I need to step up my game." Stepping up his game meant moving to a more expensive apartment, buying a nicer car, taking Jessica to restaurants that charged $50 for an entree. And because David's salary, while decent, couldn't support this lifestyle, he turned to his most reliable source: me. The requests became a monthly ritual. $200 to help with his rent because he'd overspent on a weekend trip with Jessica's friends. $300 because his car had broken down and he needed to make a good impression when picking Jessica up for dates. $500 because Jessica's birthday was coming up and he wanted to buy her something special, jewelry from Tiffany, not the kind of gifts poor people gave. I supplemented my teacher's salary by tutoring high school students in the evenings, teaching ESL classes on weekends, and selling items from my apartment piece by piece. My mother's china set, my small collection of vintage books, even my winter coat, replaced with a thinner one from a discount store, all converted to cash that flowed downstream to David's life in Manhattan. When Jessica got pregnant 2 years into their relationship, David called me in a panic. "Mom, we need to get married before the baby comes. Her family is very traditional, but weddings are expensive, and Jessica has very specific ideas about what she wants." Jessica's ideas, I learned, included a ceremony at the Plaza Hotel, a dress designed by Vera Wang, flowers flown in from Holland, and a reception meal that would cost more per plate than I spent on groceries in a month. The total bill came to $85,000. Jessica's parents agreed to pay $35,000. David asked if I could cover the remaining $50,000. $50,000. It was more money than I'd ever seen in one place, more than my annual teaching salary, more than I had in my retirement account. But it was my son's wedding, and Jessica was carrying my grandchild. How could I say no? I took out a second mortgage on my apartment. I cashed out my entire retirement savings, paying hefty penalties for early withdrawal. I borrowed against my life insurance policy. I even applied for a personal loan, lying about my income to qualify for the amount I needed. By some miracle, or perhaps by the universe's cruel design, I managed to cobble together exactly $50,000. When I handed David the cashier's check, he hugged me tighter than he had since he was a little boy. "Mom, you're amazing. I don't know what I'd do without you. Jessica and I will never forget this. We're going to make you so proud." I felt proud as I watched the wedding plans unfold. Jessica sent me pictures of her dress fittings, her flowers, the elegant invitations that cost more to print than I spent on food in 2 months. David included me in conversations about the guest list, the menu, the music. For the first time in years, I felt like part of something instead of just someone who paid for something. 3 weeks before the wedding, David called to discuss the final details. We talked about the ceremony, the reception, whom I might sit with during dinner. Then he paused, and his voice changed slightly. "Mom, there's one more thing. Jessica's been stressed about the wedding and her family. Well, they have some concerns." I asked what kind of concerns. David hesitated. "They think it might be better if you kept a low profile at the wedding. Didn't make a big deal about paying for everything. Jessica's parents want their friends to think they covered all the expenses. It's important for their reputation. Keep a low profile. Don't make a big deal." I had just sacrificed my entire financial future for this wedding, and now I was being asked to pretend I hadn't. I asked David what keeping a low profile meant exactly. "Just don't mention the money to anyone," he said quickly. "And maybe sit in the back during the ceremony instead of the front row. Jessica's grandparents are coming, and they're very traditional about family hierarchy. Her grandmother specifically requested that Jessica's family sit up front." I asked about the photographs. Surely the groom's mother would be included in the family photos that would hang in their home for decades, that would be passed down to my grandchild. David was quiet for a long moment. "We'll figure that out on the day," he said finally. "The important thing is that you'll be there to see me get married. That's what matters, right?" Right. What mattered was being there. What mattered was seeing my son happy. What mattered was celebrating the woman who was carrying my grandchild. The money was just money. The recognition was just ego. Love wasn't about getting credit. It was about giving without expecting anything in return, wasn't it? The night before the wedding, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to quiet the voice in my head that whispered I was being used. David had been distant for weeks, too busy with final preparations to return my calls promptly or visit for our usual Sunday dinners. Jessica had stopped including me in wedding conversations entirely, communicating only through David when absolutely necessary. But I told myself this was normal. Weddings were stressful. Young couples needed space to figure out their new life together. My role was to be supportive, understanding, flexible. After all, I'd had my chance to be a young bride once. Now it was Jessica's turn. I chose my outfit carefully. The navy dress I mentioned earlier, paired with my mother's pearl earrings and the one nice pair of shoes I owned. I wanted to look elegant but not flashy, appropriate but not attention-seeking. I practiced walking in the shoes, worried that my arthritis might act up during the long ceremony. I wrapped their wedding gift, a silver picture frame engraved with their wedding date, and tucked it into a small bag along with tissues for the happy tears I expected to shed. The Plaza Hotel was even more beautiful than the pictures Jessica had shown me. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, and flower arrangements taller than me marked the entrance to the ballroom. Guests in designer clothes laughed and hugged in the lobby, their voices mixing with the soft piano music that played in the background. Everyone looked confident, comfortable, like they belonged in such an elegant place. I presented my invitation to the staff member checking names at the entrance. She scanned her list once, then again, then looked up at me apologetically. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Richardson, but I don't see your name here. Let me call the wedding coordinator." The wedding coordinator arrived quickly, a young woman in a black suit who spoke in hushed, professional tones. She checked her own list, made a phone call, then returned to where I waited with growing anxiety. "Mrs. Richardson, there seems to be some confusion about the guest list. Let me contact the family directly to sort this out." That's when the security guards were called. That's when I heard my son's voice through their radio, telling them to keep me away. That's when $50,000 and 32 years of motherhood reduced themselves to 4 words. This is my day. I want you to understand something about that moment. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. It was being told that everything I had given, every sacrifice I had made, every time I had chosen his needs over my own, had led to this. Being treated like a stranger at the door of an event I had single-handedly financed. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever given so much of yourself that you forgot you were supposed to matter too? I stood outside that ballroom for another hour, watching through glass doors as my son danced with his bride, as Jessica's parents gave speeches I couldn't hear, as my granddaughter, beautiful Lila in her yellow flower girl dress, twirled and laughed with cousins I wouldn't be introduced to. I watched my own family celebrate without me, and I understood with brutal clarity that I had bought myself out of their lives. The security guards were kind. They offered to call me a taxi, suggested I might be more comfortable waiting in the hotel restaurant downstairs. But kindness from strangers couldn't heal what I was feeling. I had been fool enough to believe that love could be purchased with sacrifice, that generosity guaranteed gratitude, that being indispensable made you valuable. Instead, I learned that giving everything can leave you with nothing, including dignity. I took the subway home that night, still wearing my navy dress and mother's pearl earrings, still carrying the wrapped picture frame they would never receive. The train was nearly empty, just me and a few night shift workers heading to jobs that would pay them barely enough to survive. I looked at my reflection in the dark window and saw a 73-year-old woman who had spent her entire adult life confused about the difference between love and payment. Back in my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and did something I hadn't done in decades. I calculated what David had cost me. Not just the wedding, but everything. Every emergency loan, every rent payment, every time I had chosen his comfort over my security. The number was staggering. Nearly $200,000 over 15 years. My entire retirement, my financial security, my future, all transferred to fund his present. And for what? To be treated like an embarrassment at the wedding I had paid for. To be kept away from my own granddaughter by security guards. To discover that my son was ashamed of me, not proud of my sacrifices, but embarrassed by my existence. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to stop believing that love required me to disappear. But changing a lifetime of patterns isn't like flipping a switch. It's like learning to walk again after years of crawling, and the first steps are always the hardest. The next morning, David called. His voice was cheerful, casual, as if nothing had happened. "Hey, Mom, how are you feeling today? Wasn't the wedding beautiful? I'm sorry we didn't get to talk much, but you know how crazy wedding days are." I asked him why I hadn't been allowed into the reception. There was a pause, then a sigh. "Mom, don't make this dramatic. There was some confusion with the guest list. These things happen at big events. The important thing is that Jessica and I are married and happy." I asked him if he told the security guards to keep me away. Another pause, longer this time. "Look, Mom, Jessica's family paid for most of the wedding. They had very specific ideas about how they wanted things to go. I was trying to keep everyone happy. You understand, right? You wouldn't want me to upset my new in-laws over something so small. Something so small. Being excluded from my son's wedding was something so small." I asked him about the money I had given him, my $50,000, my entire retirement savings, my financial future sacrificed for their perfect day. David's voice became impatient. "And we're grateful for that, Mom. Really. But that was your choice. No one forced you to contribute. And honestly, dwelling on money things is kind of tacky, don't you think?" Tacky. Being concerned about my life savings was tacky. That conversation lasted 10 minutes, but it took me 10 days to process what I had heard. My son, the child I had raised, loved, supported, and sacrificed everything for, saw my financial contributions as optional gifts rather than profound sacrifices. He viewed my presence at his wedding as a potential embarrassment rather than an honor. He considered my feelings about being excluded as dramatic rather than valid. I had raised a man who took my love for granted and my money as his due. Over the next few weeks, I tried to reconnect with David and Jessica. I called to congratulate them again on their marriage. I asked about their honeymoon in Italy, another expense I had indirectly funded through the money I'd given them for wedding costs. I inquired about Jessica's pregnancy and offered to help with baby preparations. The responses were polite but distant. David was busy with work. Jessica was dealing with morning sickness. They would call me back when things settled down. They appreciated my offers to help, but they had everything under control. Everything under control. Everything except acknowledging that the woman who had made their fairy tale wedding possible deserved basic respect and inclusion in their lives. 3 months after the wedding, Jessica had a miscarriage. David called to tell me the news. His voice broken with grief. My heart ached for them both. I immediately offered to come over, to bring food, to help however I could. David said they needed space to grieve privately, but he would keep me informed about how Jessica was doing. I sent flowers to their apartment with a note expressing my sympathy and love. I called every few days to check on them, always getting voicemail, always leaving messages that weren't returned promptly. When David finally called me back after a week of silence, he sounded annoyed. "Mom, I appreciate your concern, but you're being overwhelming. Jessica is fragile right now. She doesn't need pressure from family." Pressure from family. Offering support to my son and daughter-in-law during a tragic time was pressure from family. I began to realize that everything I did, calling, visiting, offering help, expressing concern, was interpreted as too much. I was overwhelming when I cared, tacky when I mentioned money, dramatic when I had feelings about being excluded. There was no way for me to exist in their lives that didn't require me to make myself smaller, quieter, less present. So I started making myself smaller. I called less frequently. I stopped dropping by their apartment unannounced with homemade meals or small gifts. I waited for them to reach out to me instead of always initiating contact. I told myself this was respect for their privacy, consideration for their busy lives, understanding that young couples needed space. But space, I learned, can become an abyss. And once you start disappearing from someone's life, it becomes easier and easier for them to forget you were ever there. My 74th birthday came and went without a card, a call, or even a text message from David. When I mentioned this to him during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations, he apologized profusely. "Oh my God, Mom. I'm so sorry. Work has been crazy, and Jessica started a new job. We completely lost track of dates. We'll make it up to you." They never did make it up to me. My birthday became a missed opportunity that they felt bad about but didn't actually address. Like so many other things in our relationship, it was something they were sorry for in theory, but didn't change in practice. During that same phone call, David mentioned they were looking at houses in Westchester. "We want to get out of the city before we start a family again," he explained. "Jessica's parents found us a great real estate agent, and we've been looking at places with good school districts." I asked about their budget for a house. David laughed. "Way more than we can afford right now, but Jessica's dad is helping with the down payment, and we figure our salaries will increase over the next few years. We might need a little help with closing costs, though. Nothing major, just $5,000 or $10,000 to make everything work. $5,000 or $10,000. Nothing major, just more money from the woman who had already given them everything she had." This time, though, I hesitated before answering. I had been living on Social Security and the small pension from my teaching career since cashing out my retirement savings for their wedding. My monthly budget was tight enough that I shopped for groceries based on what was on sale, not what I actually wanted to eat. I had started buying generic medications because name brands were too expensive. I had canceled my cable television and relied on the library for books and movies. When I explained that I couldn't afford to help with closing costs, David's tone changed. "What do you mean you can't afford it? You helped with the wedding. This is just as important." I reminded him that I had given them $50,000 for their wedding. Money I couldn't actually afford. Money that had compromised my own financial security. David was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mom, you chose to do that. We didn't ask you to spend your retirement money. That was your decision. My decision. Helping my son achieve his dreams was my decision, and therefore my problem when it left me unable to help him achieve his next set of dreams." I asked David if he remembered all the times over the years when I had helped him financially. College expenses, apartment deposits, emergency loans, car repairs, credit card payments. Did he remember that I had been supporting him financially for over 15 years? "I've paid some of that back," he said defensively. "And besides, that's what parents do. They help their kids get established. Jessica's parents help us all the time. Jessica's parents helped them because Jessica's parents were wealthy. They owned multiple cars, took expensive vacations, and had investment portfolios that generated passive income. My help came from grocery money, heating bill funds, and retirement savings that would never be replaced." But David had never learned to distinguish between help that was abundant and help that was sacrificial. To him, money was money, regardless of what it cost the person giving it. When I said I couldn't help with the house, David became cold. Our phone calls decreased from weekly to monthly. When I called him, he was always busy, always rushing somewhere, always dealing with house hunting stress or work pressure or Jessica's needs. When he called me, it was usually because he needed something. Information about his childhood medical records, his social security number for a background check, or advice about some practical matter that he could have easily handled himself. I began to feel like a customer service department in David's life, available when he needed something, ignored when he didn't. 7 months after their wedding, Jessica got pregnant again. David called me with the news, his voice filled with excitement and relief. "We're having a girl, Mom. Jessica is doing great this time. The doctor says everything looks perfect." I was thrilled about becoming a grandmother again. Lila had been the bright spot in my life for years, and the thought of another granddaughter filled me with joy. I asked when Jessica was due, whether they had chosen a name, if they needed help preparing the nursery in their new house in Scarsdale. "We've got everything covered," David said. "Jessica's mom has been amazing. She's already bought furniture for the nursery and planned a whole baby shower. Jessica's really excited about having her mom so involved." Jessica's mom was involved, I was informed. The baby shower was held at Jessica's parents' house in Long Island. I received an invitation 2 days before the event, clearly an afterthought, probably prompted by Jessica's mother asking if the groom's mother had been invited. I couldn't attend on such short notice because I had committed to tutoring that Saturday, one of the few ways I still earned extra money to supplement my fixed income. When I called to congratulate Jessica and apologize for missing the shower, she was polite but distant. "Oh, that's fine, Margaret. We got so many beautiful gifts. Maybe you can visit after the baby is born." Maybe I could visit after the baby was born. Not, "Please come see your grandchild," or "We'd love to have you involved," or "I hope you'll be part of her life." Maybe I could visit, like a casual acquaintance who might drop by if convenient. My second granddaughter, Emma, was born on a rainy Tuesday in April. David called me from the hospital, his voice tired but happy. "She's here, Mom. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Perfectly healthy." Jessica did amazing. I asked when I could come to the hospital to meet Emma. David hesitated. "Well, Jessica's family is here right now, and visiting hours are pretty limited. Maybe tomorrow would be better? Or we might be going home by then. Let me see how Jessica feels and call you back." He didn't call me back that day, or the next day. When I finally called the hospital directly, I learned that Jessica had been discharged. When I called their house, David answered but said Jessica was sleeping and Emma was fussy. "It's probably better to wait a few more days until everyone adjusts to being home." A few more days became a week. A week became 2 weeks. I finally drove to their house in Scarsdale unannounced, bringing a handmade blanket I had crocheted for Emma and a pot of soup for Jessica. Jessica answered the door holding Emma, looking tired but radiant. "Oh, hi, Margaret. This is unexpected." Unexpected. Visiting my new granddaughter was unexpected. I asked if I could hold Emma. Jessica glanced toward the living room where I could hear other voices. Her parents, I realized, were visiting. She just ate and she's been fussy with strangers. Maybe it's better to wait until she's more settled." Strangers. I was a stranger to my own granddaughter. Jessica did invite me in, but the visit was awkward and brief. Her parents were polite, but clearly surprised by my presence. They had been helping with household tasks, cooking meals, and caring for Lila while Jessica adjusted to life with a newborn. I was an outsider looking in on a family system that had no place for me. When David came home from work, he seemed surprised and slightly annoyed to find me there. "Mom, you should have called first. We're still figuring out routines with the baby." I explained that I had called several times but hadn't heard back. David looked uncomfortable. "Things are just crazy right now. Jessica's parents have been staying here to help, and with work and the baby and Lila, there's a lot going on." Jessica's parents were staying there to help. I was an extra complication in an already complicated situation. I left after 30 minutes, having held Emma for exactly 3 minutes and exchanged pleasantries with people who clearly wished I hadn't come. As I drove home to my apartment in the city, I realized that I had become a peripheral figure in my son's life, someone to be managed rather than included, tolerated rather than welcomed. Over the next few months, I made several attempts to build a relationship with Emma and maintain my connection with Lila, who is now 10 and as wonderful as ever. But every effort felt forced, every visit felt intrusive, every phone call felt like an interruption. When I offered to babysit so David and Jessica could have a date night, they said Jessica's mother had already committed to watching the girls that weekend. When I suggested bringing dinner over to give Jessica a break from cooking, they said they had meal prep covered thanks to Jessica's mom's cooking marathon. When I asked about Emma's christening, they said they were planning something small and intimate, just immediate family. Immediate family. I was no longer immediate family. The exclusion wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual and polite. I wasn't disinvited from events. I simply wasn't included in the planning. I wasn't told I couldn't help. I was told help wasn't needed. I wasn't rejected. I was made irrelevant. And the most painful part? I had paid for the privilege of being erased from my son's life. 2 years after Emma's birth, when she was finally old enough to recognize and remember me, I tried to establish regular visits with both granddaughters. I suggested taking them for afternoon outings, to the park, to museums, to child-friendly restaurants where we could have fun together and build memories. "That's really sweet of you to offer, Mom," David said when I brought up this idea during one of our monthly phone calls. "But the girls have pretty busy schedules these days. Lila has soccer and piano lessons, and Emma is in a preschool program 3 days a week. Jessica likes to keep their routines consistent." Busy schedules. Consistent routines. Code words for, we don't actually want you to have independent relationships with your granddaughters. I asked if I could attend some of Lila's soccer games or piano recitals. David said he would ask Jessica to put me on the email list for events. But the emails never came. When I asked again, he said Jessica had been meaning to send them but kept forgetting. When I offered to contact the soccer league directly to get the schedule, David said it might be awkward since Jessica coached alongside other parents who wouldn't know who I was. Other parents who wouldn't know who I was. Because I had been kept so separate from my granddaughters' lives that even their friends' parents didn't recognize me as grandma. I began to understand that my role in David's family was to exist quietly in the background, available when needed, but invisible otherwise. I could send birthday gifts and Christmas presents, gifts that were appreciated but not acknowledged with thank you calls or photos of the girls enjoying them. I could ask about school events and activities, questions that were answered briefly and without follow-up invitations to participate. I could offer help and support, offers that were politely declined in favor of assistance from Jessica's family. I was a grandmother without grandmothering privileges, a mother-in-law without relationship access, a family member without family inclusion. The breaking point came during Emma's 4th birthday party. I had asked about the party weeks in advance, offering to help with planning or preparation. David said they were keeping it simple, just family and a few of Emma's preschool friends at their house. The day of the party, I called to ask what time I should arrive. David sounded rushed and distracted. "Actually, Mom, I'm not sure this is the best day for a visit. Emma woke up cranky, and Jessica is stressed about getting everything ready. Maybe we could celebrate with you separately next weekend?" Celebrate separately. My granddaughter's birthday was something to be celebrated separately from her actual birthday party. I asked if I could just drop off Emma's gift and give her a quick hug. David hesitated. "The thing is, a bunch of people are already here, and Jessica's parents brought some of their friends. It's gotten bigger than we planned, and the house is pretty chaotic." Chaotic. My presence would make my granddaughter's birthday party chaotic. I ended the phone call and sat in my apartment, looking at the carefully wrapped present I had bought for Emma, a set of art supplies along with a small easel, because Lila had mentioned Emma loved to draw. I had spent 2 hours walking through the toy store, picking out items I thought would spark Emma's creativity and bring her joy. I had written a card telling her how proud I was to be her grandma, how much I loved watching her grow, how excited I was to see what amazing things she would create. The present would be delivered next weekend, during a separate celebration that felt more like an obligation than a joy. That night, I did something I hadn't done since David's wedding. I looked at social media. Jessica had posted dozens of photos from Emma's party. There were pictures of Emma blowing out candles on a beautiful homemade cake, surrounded by children and adults who loved her. There were shots of the decorations, the food, the games, the presents being opened. Jessica's parents were prominently featured, helping with activities and laughing with guests. I scrolled through 47 photos of my granddaughter's birthday party, and I wasn't in a single one. Not because I had chosen not to attend, but because I hadn't been welcome there. The comments on Jessica's photos were filled with praise for her party planning skills, congratulations on Emma's milestone, and expressions of what a wonderful time everyone had. Jessica's mother had commented, "So blessed to be part of this beautiful family celebration. Blessed to be part of the celebration." While I sat at home with a wrapped present and a card that would never capture the joy of being present for the moment itself, that's when I finally admitted something I had been avoiding for months. My son was ashamed of me. Not ashamed of anything I had done, but ashamed of who I was. I wasn't wealthy enough, sophisticated enough, connected enough to fit comfortably into the life he had built with Jessica. My presence reminded him of his modest beginnings, his years of financial struggle, his dependence on his mother's sacrifices. I had spent 15 years sacrificing my own financial security to help David build a better life. And now that better life had no room for the woman who had made it possible. The next weekend, I delivered Emma's birthday present during a brief scheduled visit that felt more like a transaction than a celebration. Emma liked the art supplies and gave me a distracted hug while playing with toys from her actual party. David and Jessica were polite but hurried, explaining they had dinner plans with friends and needed to get the girls fed and changed. I stayed for 45 minutes, played briefly with both granddaughters, and left with the familiar feeling that I had been tolerated rather than welcomed. During the drive home, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my relationships forever. I decided to stop trying so hard to be included in a life that didn't want me. But stopping isn't the same as healing. And healing, I would learn, required more than just stepping back. It required stepping forward into a version of myself I had forgotten existed. The first thing I did was stop calling David every week. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I was tired of having conversations where I asked questions he answered briefly, where I offered help he declined politely, where I expressed interest in his life that he didn't reciprocate in mine. I waited to see how long it would take him to call me. 3 weeks passed before my phone rang. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you doing?" I asked him the same question, and he launched into a detailed update about work stress, house projects, Jessica's new part-time job, Lila's school activities, and Emma's preschool progress. He talked for 15 minutes about his life, then asked, "So what's new with you?" What was new with me? I realized I had been so focused on his life for so long that I didn't have much of my own to discuss. I mumbled something about staying busy with tutoring and reading, and the conversation wound down quickly. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment and took inventory of my life. I was 76 years old, living alone in a rent-stabilized apartment on the Upper West Side. My financial resources were severely limited due to the money I had given David over the years. My social circle was almost non-existent. I had lost touch with most of my teacher colleagues after retiring, and I had never developed friendships outside of work because David's needs had consumed most of my free time and emotional energy. I spent most of my days alone, reading library books, watching free television, and waiting for phone calls from a son who contacted me out of obligation rather than desire. I had become a woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in being needed by people who no longer wanted to need me. That realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure. Devastating because it forced me to confront how small my life had become. Liberating because it meant I could start making it bigger. I started by doing something I hadn't done in years. I made plans that had nothing to do with David or his family. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center near my apartment. I joined a book club at the local library. I volunteered to tutor adult literacy students through a program run by the public school system. These activities brought me into contact with other people, mostly women around my age, who were also navigating the challenges of aging, fixed incomes, and complicated family relationships. I discovered that my story, adult children who took advantage of parental generosity, grandchildren who were kept at arm's length, feeling invisible in your own family, was depressingly common. My daughter calls me when she needs money or free babysitting. said Helen, a woman in my book club whose son had moved to California and rarely called. Otherwise, I'm lucky if I hear from her once a month. My son borrowed $20,000 from me 5 years ago to start a business, shared Rosa, who sat next to me in painting class. The business failed, and he's never mentioned paying me back, but he can afford a vacation to Mexico every year. I raised my grandson for 3 years while his parents got their lives together, said Carmen, who volunteered at the literacy center on the same days I did. Now that they're stable, they've decided I'm too old to babysit and hired a professional nanny instead. Listening to these women's stories helped me understand that I wasn't uniquely foolish or particularly unlucky. I was part of a generation of women who had been taught that love meant sacrifice, that good mothers gave endlessly, that family loyalty required financial and emotional support regardless of how that support was received or reciprocated. We had raised children during an era when parenting advice focused on building self-esteem and providing opportunities, not on teaching reciprocity and gratitude. We had given our children everything we could afford and more, believing that our sacrifices would create bonds of love and appreciation that would last forever. Instead, many of us had raised adults who saw our generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift, who measured our worth by what we could provide rather than who we were as people. The more time I spent with other women in similar situations, the more clearly I could see my own patterns. I had spent decades defining my worth through David's achievements, measuring my success as a mother by his happiness and comfort. When he succeeded, I felt proud. When he struggled, I felt responsible. When he excluded me, I felt like a failure. But David's choices about how to treat me were not reflections of my worth as a person or my success as a mother. They were reflections of the values he had developed, the priorities he had chosen, and the kind of man he had decided to become. This distinction took months to internalize. For 43 years, David's well-being had been the central organizing principle of my life. Learning to separate his choices from my value as a human being felt like learning to breathe with different lungs. During this period of self-reflection and gradual healing, David continued to call monthly with updates about his life. He never asked detailed questions about my activities or expressed interest in my emotional well-being. Our conversations followed a predictable pattern. He would share news about work, Jessica, the girls, and their house, then ask a general, "How are you doing?" before ending the call with, "Love you, Mom, talk soon." I began to notice that David's version of loving me required me to remain small, predictable, and uncomplicated. He wanted me to be available when he needed to share good news or ask for advice, but not to have needs, opinions, or expectations of my own. He wanted me to be proud of his achievements without pointing out that I had enabled them through financial sacrifice. He wanted me to be grateful for limited access to his family without asking for more involvement. In short, he wanted me to love him unconditionally while offering me only conditional inclusion in return. This realization led me to the most difficult decision I had made since his wedding. I decided to change the terms of our relationship. The opportunity came 6 months later, when David called with a familiar request. He and Jessica were considering renovating their kitchen, a project that would cost $30,000. Their contractor needed a deposit to begin work, but they wouldn't have the full amount available until Jessica received her year-end bonus in December. "I know this is a big ask, Mom," David said, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. "But we were wondering if you could help with the deposit. Just $5,000 to get things started. We'll pay you back as soon as Jessica gets her bonus." $5,000. Just $5,000 from a woman living on Social Security and a teacher's pension to help fund a kitchen renovation in a house she was rarely invited to visit. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't immediately look for ways to make the impossible possible. I didn't mentally review my budget to see where I could cut expenses or consider which remaining assets I could liquidate. I didn't feel the familiar panic of potentially disappointing my son or the crushing weight of being needed beyond my capacity to give. Instead, I felt something I had never experienced when David asked for money. Calm. "David," I said quietly, "I can't help with the kitchen renovation." There was silence on the other end of the line. David was clearly surprised. I had never refused a financial request before. "Oh," he said finally. "Is it a bad time? I know 5,000 is a lot, but you've always been so generous when we really needed help." I explained that I couldn't afford to lend him $5,000 because I was living on a fixed income and had no savings left, after funding his wedding and previous requests for help. "But this isn't like those other times," David said, his tone becoming slightly argumentative. "This is a loan, not a gift. We'll definitely pay you back." I pointed out that he had described many previous requests as loans that would definitely be paid back, but that very little money had ever been returned. David was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've paid back some of it." Some of it. Over the years, David had returned maybe $3,000 of the nearly $200,000 I had given him, but he remembered some of it as evidence that he honored our financial agreements. When I declined again, David's voice changed. "Mom, I don't understand why you're being difficult about this. We're family. Family helps each other. And it's not like you have anyone else to spend money on." "It's not like you have anyone else to spend money on." My son saw me as a woman whose only purpose was to fund his lifestyle, whose only value was my ability to solve his financial problems. I told David that I loved him, but that I could no longer afford to help him financially. I explained that I needed to preserve what little money I had left to support myself as I aged. I reminded him that I had already given him my entire retirement savings and couldn't afford to compromise my basic security any further. David listened to this explanation, then said, "I guess I didn't realize you were having money problems. Maybe you should think about moving to a cheaper apartment or something. Maybe I should think about moving to a cheaper apartment so that I could free up money to fund his kitchen renovation." That conversation lasted another 10 minutes, but I remained firm in my refusal. David was clearly frustrated and confused by my uncharacteristic response. He had called expecting to receive help, as he always had, and instead received boundaries that had never existed before. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because saying no to David felt like rejecting him, even though I knew it was really rejecting his attempt to use me. Relief because I had finally acted in my own interest instead of reflexively sacrificing for his. 3 weeks passed before David called again. When he did, his tone was distant and formal. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing?" I asked about the kitchen renovation. David said they had decided to postpone the project until they could afford it on their own. "Jessica wasn't that excited about it anyway," he added, which seemed unlikely given his previous description of their eagerness to begin work. The conversation was brief and awkward. David didn't share updates about work or the girls, and he didn't ask questions about my life. We exchanged the kind of pleasantries you might have with a distant acquaintance, and he ended the call quickly. I realized that David's affection for me was contingent on my usefulness to him. When I was available to solve problems and provide financial support, he was warm and chatty. When I established boundaries around what I could afford to give, he became cold and distant. This wasn't love, it was transaction, and I had been confusing the two for decades. Over the next several months, David's calls became less frequent and increasingly brief. He no longer shared detailed updates about his life or asked for advice about personal matters. Our relationship narrowed to surface-level check-ins where we exchanged basic information about health and weather, then ended the conversation quickly. I missed the son who used to call me with excitement about work promotions or funny stories about the girls, but I realized that version of David only appeared when he needed something from me or wanted to share good news that reflected well on him. He had never called simply to ask how I was doing or to offer support during difficult times in my life. The relationship I mourned, a close mother-son bond built on mutual affection and genuine interest in each other's lives, had never actually existed. It had been a one-sided attachment where I provided consistent emotional and financial support while receiving occasional updates and requests in return. Accepting this reality was like grieving the death of someone who had never been alive. I mourned the loss of a relationship I had always hoped for, but never actually had. During this period of emotional processing, something unexpected happened. I began to feel lighter. The constant worry about David's problems, the ongoing calculations of how to afford his requests, the persistent anxiety about whether I was doing enough to maintain his affection, all of that mental and emotional weight began to lift. For the first time in decades, my thoughts weren't dominated by concerns about my son's needs and desires. I could read a book without wondering if David needed help with something. I could go to sleep without worrying about financial emergencies that might require my intervention. I could make plans for my own life without wondering if David would call with requests that would derail them. The removal of this psychological burden was like taking off a backpack I hadn't realized I was carrying. I felt more energetic, more optimistic, more present in my own experience. I also began to notice things about my environment and interests that I had ignored for years while focusing on David's life. I rediscovered my love of classical music and spent hours listening to radio concerts. I reconnected with my enjoyment of cooking, experimenting with recipes from library cookbooks instead of always choosing dishes based on economy and speed. I started taking long walks through Central Park, paying attention to seasonal changes and architectural details that had become invisible during years of rushing through life focused on destinations rather than journeys. Most importantly, I began to develop friendships with other women who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Helen from book club started calling to share thoughts about novels we were reading together. Rosa from art class invited me to visit a museum exhibition of watercolor paintings. Carmen from the literacy program asked if I wanted to attend a lecture about local history. These women were interested in my opinions, grateful for my company, and generous with their own attention and care. They remembered things I told them about my life and asked follow-up questions during later conversations. They invited me to participate in activities because they enjoyed my presence, not because they needed something from me. Experiencing genuine friendship helped me recognize how transactional my relationship with David had become. These women wanted to spend time with me. David wanted me to solve problems for him. These women remembered my concerns and asked about my well-being. David shared his news and expected me to respond with pride and support. These women valued my perspective and experience. David saw me as a resource to be managed and deployed as needed. The contrast was stark and painful, but also clarifying. I finally understood what healthy relationships looked like, and I could see clearly that my relationship with David was not healthy. This recognition coincided with an event that would test every boundary I had established and every insight I had gained. Emma's 5th birthday party. 2 weeks before the party, David called with an unexpected invitation. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that we're having Emma's birthday party here at the house on Saturday the 15th. It starts at 2 o'clock. We'd love for you to come." The invitation was such a departure from previous exclusions that I was momentarily speechless. After a year of distant, brief phone calls and clear boundaries around money, David was suddenly welcoming me back into family celebrations. I asked if I should bring anything or if there was any way I could help with preparations. David said Jessica had everything organized, but that Emma had specifically asked if Grandma Margaret would be coming to her party. Emma had asked about me. My granddaughter wanted me at her birthday celebration. The invitation filled me with hope and anxiety in equal measure. Hope because it suggested that David might be recognizing the value of my presence in his family's life. Anxiety because I worried about what might have motivated this change, and whether the party would be genuinely welcoming or another exercise in managing family obligations. I spent considerable time choosing an outfit and selecting a gift for Emma. I wanted to look presentable but not overdressed, generous with the gift but not extravagant in a way that might create awkwardness. I wrote and rewrote a birthday card, trying to strike the right balance between expressing my love and avoiding sentimentality that might feel excessive. On the day of the party, I drove to Scarsdale feeling nervous but optimistic. The house looked festive, with balloons tied to the mailbox and children's laughter audible from the backyard. I parked on the street and walked to the front door with Emma's gift and a fruit salad I had prepared as a contribution to the party. Jessica answered the door, and her smile seemed genuinely warm. "Margaret, I'm so glad you could come. Emma has been asking about you all morning." Inside, the house was decorated beautifully for the party, with a princess theme that reflected Emma's current interests. Children were playing games in the living room while adults chatted in the kitchen and dining room. Jessica's parents were there, along with several other couples I didn't recognize, presumably parents of Emma's friends. Emma ran to me as soon as she saw me, wrapping her arms around my legs in an enthusiastic hug. "Grandma Margaret, you came to my party!" Holding Emma, feeling her genuine excitement about my presence, filled my heart with a joy I hadn't experienced in months. This was why I had sacrificed so much for so many years. Moments like this, when family love felt real and reciprocal. Emma dragged me around the party, introducing me to her friends as my Grandma Margaret, and showing me the various activities Jessica had organized. I felt included and welcome in a way I hadn't experienced at family events in years. David was warm and attentive, checking to make sure I had something to drink and introducing me to other adults at the party. "This is my mom, Margaret," he said proudly to a couple standing near the kitchen island. "She's a retired teacher. Emma adores her." For 2 hours, I felt like a cherished member of the family again. I helped with party games, served cake, took photos of Emma opening presents, and participated in conversations with other adults about grandparenting, retirement, and life in Westchester County. Several people commented on what a lovely family David and Jessica had created, and I felt proud to be associated with their obvious happiness and success. As the party wound down and guests began leaving, David approached me while I was helping Jessica collect paper plates and empty cups. "Mom, could I talk to you privately for a minute?" We stepped into his home office, and David closed the door. His demeanor immediately became more serious, less celebratory. "I wanted to thank you for coming today, and for the beautiful gift you gave Emma. She was so excited to see you." I told him how much I had enjoyed the party, and how grateful I was to be included. "It felt wonderful to be part of Emma's special day," I said. David nodded. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Jessica and I have been discussing our financial situation, and we've realized we need to be more strategic about our spending and planning for the future." My heart began to sink as I recognized the transition from gratitude to request that had characterized so many of our interactions over the years. "We're planning to refinance the house to take advantage of lower interest rates," David continued. "But the closing costs are going to be significant, probably around $8,000. We were hoping you might be able to help us out with that expense." $8,000. He had invited me to Emma's birthday party as a prelude to asking for $8,000. "I know you said you couldn't help with the kitchen renovation," David said quickly, seeing my expression change. "But this is different. This is an investment that will save us money in the long run. Lower monthly payments, better financial security for the girls' future." I asked David if he remembered our previous conversation about my financial limitations, about the fact that I had no savings left and was living on Social Security and my teacher's pension. "I remember," he said, "but I also know you're resourceful when family really needs help. Maybe you could take out another mortgage on your apartment? The equity must have increased over the years." Another mortgage on my apartment. He wanted me to borrow against my home, my only remaining asset, my security in old age, to fund his house refinancing. I stood in his office, surrounded by diplomas and photos documenting his successful career and beautiful family, and realized that the birthday party invitation hadn't represented a new beginning in our relationship. It had been strategic manipulation, designed to make me feel valued and included before presenting another financial request. I told David that I couldn't help with the refinancing costs, just as I couldn't help with the kitchen renovation. I explained again that I had no money available to lend, and that taking another mortgage on my apartment would jeopardize my housing security. David's expression hardened. "So you're saying you won't help us secure our financial future, even though it would ultimately benefit your granddaughters?" I told him that I had already contributed nearly $200,000 to his financial security over the years, including my entire retirement savings for his wedding. I reminded him that I had never been repaid for most of these contributions, despite promises that they were loans rather than gifts. "Those were different circumstances," David said dismissively. "And besides, it's not like you were saving that money for anything specific. You don't exactly have expensive hobbies or a lavish lifestyle." "I don't exactly have expensive hobbies or a lavish lifestyle. My son saw my modest living as evidence that I didn't deserve financial security, rather than as proof that I had sacrificed my comfort for his benefit." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but I remained firm in my refusal. David became increasingly frustrated, cycling through various arguments. Family loyalty, the girl's future, my responsibility as a grandmother, the fact that I had always helped before. Finally, David said something that revealed the true nature of his feelings about our relationship. I don't understand why you're being so selfish now. After all these years of being supportive, it's like you've changed into a completely different person. Selfish. Protecting my basic financial security was selfish. Refusing to mortgage my home to fund his investment strategy was selfish. Saying no after decades of saying yes was evidence that I had become a different person, apparently, a worse person. I left Emma's birthday party that afternoon, knowing that my relationship with David had reached a point of no return. He had clearly invited me to the celebration as setup for a financial request, and when that request was refused, he was angry and resentful rather than understanding and respectful. The warm inclusion I had experienced during the party, the introductions to other parents, the pride in calling me his mother, the apparent happiness about my presence, had all been performative. David was motivated by what I might contribute to his financial well-being, not by genuine desire for my company or recognition of my value as a family member. Driving home from Scarsdale that evening, I made a decision that would define the rest of my relationship with David. I decided to stop hoping he would change and start accepting who he had already shown himself to be. This decision was both devastating and liberating. Devastating, because it meant acknowledging that my son, the child I had raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for, saw me primarily as a source of financial support rather than as a person worthy of unconditional love and respect. Liberating because it freed me from the exhausting cycle of trying to earn his affection through generosity and sacrifice. I had spent decades believing that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, helped enough, David would eventually recognize my worth and treat me with the love and respect I craved. But David had already received decades of evidence about my character, my devotion, and my willingness to sacrifice for his benefit. If that evidence hadn't inspired him to value me appropriately, no future action on my part would change his fundamental attitude toward our relationship. I was 76 years old, and I was done trying to prove my worth to someone who had decided it was limited to my bank account balance. 3 weeks after Emma's birthday party, David called me. His voice was cold and formal, completely different from the warm tone he had used when introducing me to other parents at the party. "Mom, Jessica and I need to talk to you about boundaries and expectations going forward." Boundaries and expectations. He wanted to discuss boundaries and expectations after decades of my having none where he was concerned. "We've been thinking about family dynamics lately," David continued, "and we feel like there's been some tension around financial issues that isn't healthy for anyone, especially the girls." Financial issues. My inability to fund his lifestyle indefinitely was a financial issue that was creating tension. David explained that he and Jessica had decided it would be better for everyone if we simplified our relationship by removing money discussions entirely. "From now on, we won't ask you for financial help, and we'd prefer that you don't bring up previous loans or contributions. We think it's healthier if we all just move forward without focusing on financial history." Move forward without focusing on financial history. He wanted to pretend that 15 years of financial exploitation hadn't happened, while continuing to benefit from the lifestyle my sacrifices had enabled. I asked David what this simplification would mean for our relationship practically. Would I be invited to family events? Would I have regular opportunities to spend time with my granddaughters? Would he continue calling me monthly to share news about his life? "We'll definitely stay in touch," David said vaguely. "But we think it's important to have more realistic expectations about how much time we can spend together. Jessica and I have busy careers, the girls have lots of activities, and we're trying to focus on our immediate family unit." Immediate family unit. After 43 years of being David's primary support system, I was no longer part of his immediate family unit. "We're not cutting you out," David said, perhaps sensing my silence as distress. "We just think everyone will be happier if we have appropriate boundaries." Appropriate boundaries. Like not expecting to be included in family celebrations after paying for them. Like not assuming that financial support would be reflected in emotional inclusion. Like not thinking that raising a child for 18 years and supporting him financially for 15 more years earned me a permanent place in his life. I told David that I understood what he was saying, and that I respected his right to define his family relationships however he chose. I also told him that I hoped he would understand if my own behavior changed in response to these new boundaries. "What do you mean?" David asked warily. I explained that if he was establishing boundaries around what he was willing to give in our relationship, I would need to establish boundaries around what I was willing to give as well. I told him that I loved him and would always be his mother, but that I could no longer be available for one-sided conversations where I provided support and encouragement without receiving meaningful connection in return. David was quiet for a long moment. "I guess I don't understand what you're asking for." I wasn't asking for anything anymore. I was informing him that I was stepping back from our relationship until and unless he developed the ability to value me for who I was rather than what I could provide. "We can't force you to want a relationship with us," David said finally, his tone suggesting that I was the one creating distance, rather than responding to distance he had already created. "But I think you should consider how this affects Lila and Emma. They love their grandmother, and they don't deserve to lose that relationship because of disagreements between adults." This was the most manipulative thing David had ever said to me. He was using his children as emotional weapons, threatening me with the loss of my granddaughters if I didn't continue accepting minimal inclusion in their lives. I told David that I loved Lila and Emma more than he could possibly understand, and that nothing would make me happier than having genuine relationships with them. But I pointed out that he was the one controlling my access to them, and that he was the one who had limited our interactions to brief, supervised visits that served his convenience rather than our connection. "If you truly want me to have a relationship with my granddaughters," I said, "you have the power to make that happen. You can invite me to their school events, encourage them to call me, and create opportunities for us to spend time together. The question is whether you want that to happen." David ended our conversation by saying he needed to think about everything we had discussed. "This isn't how I wanted things to go between us, Mom." But it was exactly how he had made things go between us. Through years of taking my support for granted, excluding me from significant family events, treating me like a resource rather than a person, and prioritizing Jessica's family over his own mother, David had systematically diminished my place in his life until I had finally stopped accepting diminishment. That phone call was 6 months ago. David has called me 3 times since then. Brief, awkward conversations where we exchanged basic information about health and weather before he found reasons to end the calls quickly. He has not apologized for excluding me from his wedding after I paid for it. He has not acknowledged the financial sacrifices I made to support his education and lifestyle. He has not expressed interest in my well-being or included me in his family's activities. He has not allowed me meaningful access to my granddaughters or encouraged them to develop independent relationships with me. In short, David has chosen to maintain the exact relationship dynamic I told him I could no longer accept. But here's what has happened in my life during these 6 months of minimal contact with David. I have flourished. Without the constant emotional drain of trying to maintain a one-sided relationship, I have had energy to invest in connections that actually value my presence. Helen from book club has become a close friend who calls me several times a week to discuss everything from novels to grandchildren to concerns about aging. Rosa from art class and I have started attending museum exhibitions together, and we've discovered a shared love of abstract expressionist painting. Carmen from the literacy program has introduced me to her extended family, and I've been invited to several gatherings where I'm welcomed as a friend rather than tolerated as an obligation. I've also started dating, something I never thought I'd do at 76. His name is Frank, and he's a retired social worker who volunteers at the same literacy program where I teach. Frank is kind, intelligent, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences. He asks questions about my past, remembers details I share about my concerns, and includes me in decisions about how we spend time together. He appreciates my cooking, enjoys my company, and treats me like someone whose presence adds value to his life. Most surprisingly, Frank is curious about my relationship with David and supportive of the boundaries I've established. When I first explained the situation, I was worried he would judge me for giving up on my son or abandoning my granddaughters. Instead, Frank nodded knowingly and said, "It sounds like you finally learned to value yourself appropriately. That's not giving up. That's growing up." Through Frank, I've met other people our age who are navigating complicated relationships with adult children. I've learned that my experience is sadly common, and that many older adults struggle with the balance between supporting their children and maintaining their own dignity and financial security. I've also started engaging in activities I had forgotten I enjoyed. I'm taking piano lessons for the first time since I was a teenager. I've joined a hiking group for seniors that explores different parks and nature preserves around the metropolitan area. I've started volunteering at a local animal shelter where I help socialize cats and dogs waiting for adoption. All of these activities bring me joy and satisfaction that doesn't depend on anyone else's appreciation or recognition. I'm learning to measure my worth by my own experiences of fulfillment rather than by other people's expressions of need for my help. My apartment, which had felt empty and sad for so many years, now feels peaceful and purposeful. I've decorated it with paintings from my art class and photos from hiking trips. I've created a reading corner with comfortable chairs and good lighting. I've started cooking elaborate meals for myself, remembering that I deserve care and attention even when no one else is around to witness it. Most importantly, I've stopped waiting for David to change and started accepting that our relationship is what it is. He is a man who values financial assistance more than emotional connection, who sees his mother as a resource rather than a person, who views family relationships as transactions rather than bonds. These aren't temporary character flaws that will improve with time or patience. They are fundamental aspects of who David has chosen to become. Accepting this reality has been painful, but ultimately liberating. I no longer wake up hoping today will be the day David calls to apologize or to invite me to spend time with my granddaughters. I no longer check my phone constantly, wondering if I've missed important family news. I no longer calculate how I might afford to help with his latest financial need, or worry about disappointing him by saying no. Instead, I wake up planning activities I enjoy, spending time with people who value my company, and investing emotional energy in relationships that reciprocate care and attention. 2 weeks ago, something happened that tested my resolve and confirmed the wisdom of the boundaries I had established. Emma, my youngest granddaughter, had an appendectomy that required emergency surgery. I learned about it 3 days after the fact, not from David, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned seeing Jessica's social media posts about the hospital stay. The old Margaret would have been devastated by this exclusion. I would have called David repeatedly, demanded to know why I wasn't informed about my granddaughter's medical emergency, insisted on visiting Emma in the hospital, regardless of whether my presence was welcome. The new Margaret felt sad about missing the opportunity to support Emma during a frightening experience, but she wasn't surprised that David hadn't included her in the crisis. This exclusion was consistent with the relationship pattern he had established. I was informed about his family's life when convenient for him, not when my concern and support might be meaningful. I sent Emma a get well card with stickers and a small stuffed animal I thought she might enjoy during her recovery. I didn't call David to discuss the situation or demand explanations about why I hadn't been contacted. I didn't make the medical emergency about my feelings or needs. David called me 2 days after Emma came home from the hospital. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that Emma had her appendix removed last week, but she's doing great now." I told him I was glad she was recovering well, and I asked if there was anything I could do to help during her recuperation. David said Jessica's mother was staying with them for a few days to help with Emma's care and Lila's school schedule. Jessica's mother was helping. I was being informed after the fact. The old Margaret would have pointed out the unfairness of this arrangement, would have argued that I deserved the opportunity to help my granddaughter, would have fought for inclusion in the nursing and caregiving that grandmothers traditionally provide. The new Margaret simply said, "I'm glad Emma has good support during her recovery. Please give her my love." David seemed surprised by my lack of drama around the situation. He had perhaps expected me to create conflict that would justify his decision to exclude me. When I responded with calm acceptance instead of anger or demands, he seemed almost disappointed. "I'm sorry we didn't call you right away," he said finally. Everything happened so fast, and with Jessica's parents available to help immediately. I told David that I understood he had made decisions based on his family's needs and convenience. I didn't try to make him feel guilty about those decisions or argue for different ones in the future. I accepted his choices and responded accordingly. After we hung up, I realized something profound had shifted in my emotional relationship to David's treatment of me. His exclusion from Emma's medical crisis didn't devastate me because I no longer expected inclusion in his family's life. His failure to value my concern and support didn't surprise me, because I had accepted that he didn't value those qualities in our relationship. Most importantly, his choices about how to treat me no longer determined my sense of self-worth. I was sad that Emma had been frightened and in pain, and I wished I could have comforted her. But David's decision not to contact me wasn't a reflection of my inadequacy as a grandmother. It was a reflection of his priorities as a son. This emotional detachment has been the most liberating aspect of stepping back from my relationship with David. For decades, his behavior toward me determined my mood, my self-esteem, and my sense of purpose. When he needed my help, I felt valuable. When he excluded me from events, I felt worthless. When he called to share good news, I felt proud. When he ignored my attempts at connection, I felt forgotten. Now, David's behavior affects me much less intensely because I've learned to validate myself independently of his reactions. I know I was a devoted mother who sacrificed enormously for his benefit. I know I was a generous person who helped him achieve security and success he couldn't have attained alone. I know I deserved gratitude, respect, and inclusion in the life I helped him build. David's failure to recognize these truths doesn't make them less true. His inability to appreciate my sacrifices doesn't diminish their significance. His choice to exclude me from family events doesn't mean I'm unworthy of inclusion. I spent 43 years trying to earn David's love through generosity, sacrifice, and unconditional support. I've finally learned that love that must be earned isn't really love at all. It's payment for services rendered. Real love, the kind I experience with Frank, with my book club friends, with the women in my art class, doesn't require me to prove my worth through constant giving. It recognizes my value as a human being independent of what I can provide or contribute. This distinction has transformed not just my relationship with David, but my entire approach to human connection. I no longer agree to social obligations out of guilt or fear of disappointing people. I don't automatically say yes to requests for help without considering whether I have the resources and desire to assist. I don't measure my worth by how much other people need me. Instead, I choose relationships and activities that bring mutual joy and satisfaction. I spend time with people who are as interested in my well-being as I am in theirs. I invest emotional energy in connections that reciprocate care and attention. This shift has made my life immeasurably richer, even though it has cost me the illusion of closeness with David and access to my granddaughters. I miss Lila and Emma terribly, and I grieve the relationship I will never have with them. But I refuse to purchase limited access to them through continued financial exploitation and emotional diminishment. If David ever decides he wants a genuine relationship with me, one based on mutual respect and affection rather than my utility to his family, I will be open to rebuilding our connection. But that decision must come from him, motivated by recognition of my worth rather than need for my resources. In the meantime, I'm living a life of dignity, purpose, and genuine human connection. I'm surrounded by people who value my presence, enjoy my company, and include me in decisions about our shared activities. I'm financially secure within my modest means, emotionally fulfilled through meaningful relationships, and intellectually stimulated by learning new skills and exploring new interests. At 76 years old, I've finally learned that I deserve to be loved for who I am, rather than what I can give. This knowledge came too late to save my relationship with my son, but it's not too late to transform the rest of my life. Last month, Frank and I took a weekend trip to Cape Cod. We stayed in a small bed and breakfast, walked along beaches I had dreamed of visiting for years, and ate seafood dinners while watching the sunset over the Atlantic Ocean. It was a simple pleasure that would have been impossible when I was directing all my financial and emotional resources toward David's needs and crises. Sitting on that beach, holding hands with a man who chose to be with me because he enjoyed my company, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: peace. Not the peace of resignation or defeat, but the peace of alignment. living in accordance with my own values and priorities rather than constantly adapting myself to meet other people's expectations and demands. I thought about 17-year-old Margaret, standing in the living room of her parents' house in Brooklyn, holding her acceptance letter to Hunter College, and dreaming of becoming a teacher who would inspire young minds and make a difference in the world. That young woman had plans and ambitions that extended far beyond becoming someone else's source of financial support. Somewhere along the way, I had lost track of that young woman's dreams and replaced them with the singular goal of enabling my son's happiness. I had made David's success my purpose, his needs my priority, his welfare my responsibility. But David's happiness was never my responsibility. It was his own. My responsibility was to raise him with values that would allow him to create fulfillment for himself, not to sacrifice my own fulfillment to provide his. I succeeded in that responsibility more than I realized. David is successful, educated, financially secure, and surrounded by people who care about him. He achieved these things through a combination of his own efforts and opportunities I helped provide. My sacrifices contributed to his success, but they weren't required for his happiness. David would have been fine, perhaps better off, if I had maintained appropriate boundaries around money and taught him to value relationships more than financial assistance. He would have learned to appreciate the people in his life for their intrinsic worth rather than their utility. He might have developed empathy, gratitude, and reciprocity that would have enriched all of his relationships. By giving him everything he wanted, I may have prevented him from developing the character traits that create lasting satisfaction and meaningful connections. My overgiving didn't serve him any better than it served me. This realization has helped me forgive myself for the choices I made during David's childhood and early adulthood. I was doing what I thought was best for him, based on beliefs about parenting and sacrifice that were common among women of my generation. I couldn't have known that unconditional generosity might undermine rather than support his development into a caring, appreciative adult. But I can make different choices now, for both of us. By maintaining boundaries around what I'm willing to accept in our relationship, I'm giving David an opportunity to develop the reciprocity and appreciation he never learned before. He can choose to value me as a person rather than a resource, or he can choose to maintain distance from someone who no longer enables his taking. Either choice is acceptable to me. If David decides he wants a genuine relationship built on mutual respect and affection, I'll be delighted to rebuild our connection. If he decides that a relationship without financial benefit isn't worth his investment, I'll be sad, but not surprised. What I won't do is continue sacrificing my dignity and security for the illusion of closeness with someone who doesn't truly value my presence in his life. This boundary isn't punishment. It's self-preservation. It's the difference between love and martyrdom, between relationship and exploitation, between family and transaction. 3 months ago, I received an unexpected phone call that tested my resolve once more. It was from Lila, my older granddaughter, who is now 13 and apparently has her own cell phone. "Grandma Margaret," she said tentatively when I answered. "It's Lila. I hope it's okay that I'm calling you." Hearing her voice after so many months of silence filled my heart with joy and pain in equal measure. Joy because I missed her terribly and loved her dearly. Pain because I knew this call probably meant David and Jessica were using her to attempt emotional manipulation. I told Lila I was delighted to hear from her and asked how she was doing. She chatted for a few minutes about school, friends, and soccer season. Then her voice became more serious. "Grandma Margaret, I wanted to ask you something. Mom and Dad said you don't want to see our family anymore because of some grown-up problems. Is that true?" There it was. The emotional manipulation I had expected. David and Jessica had told Lila that I was the one creating distance in our relationship, rather than simply responding to distance they had created. I took a deep breath and chose my words carefully. I explained to Lila that I loved her and Emma very much, and that nothing would make me happier than spending time with them regularly. I told her that sometimes adults have disagreements about how to treat each other, and that I was hoping her father and I could work out our differences so I could be more involved in their lives. "But you could come visit us anytime," Lila said. "Mom and Dad would be happy if you called more often." I asked Lila if her parents had suggested that she call me. She was quiet for a moment, then admitted, "Mom said, Maybe you were lonely and would like to hear from me. And Dad said you might want to help with something for Emma's school fundraiser? There it was. The real purpose of the call. David and Jessica were using Lila to solicit my participation in a school fundraiser, probably one that required financial contribution. I told Lila that I was always happy to hear from her, regardless of the reason. I asked about the fundraiser, and she explained that Emma's school was trying to raise money for new playground equipment. Families were being asked to contribute what they could, and there were also opportunities to volunteer for fundraising events. I told Lila I would be happy to make a modest donation to Emma's school. I also told her that if her parents ever wanted me to attend school events, volunteer activities, or family gatherings, all they had to do was invite me. "Why don't you just call Dad and ask if you can come to stuff?" Lila asked with the directness that only teenagers possess. I explained to Lila that I had learned it was better to wait for invitations rather than asking to be included in events where my presence might not be genuinely welcome. I told her that when people want you to be part of their activities, they include you in the planning and make sure you know you're wanted. Lila was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she said something that broke my heart. "I think Mom and Dad are mad at you about money stuff, but I don't understand why that means I can't see you." I told Lila that she was absolutely right. Adult disagreements shouldn't prevent grandparents and grandchildren from having relationships. I explained that I was always available if she wanted to talk, and that I would love to spend time with her whenever her parents were comfortable arranging it. "Could I call you sometimes?" Lila asked. "Even if it's not about fundraisers or anything?" I told her that nothing would make me happier than regular phone calls just to talk and catch up. I gave her my number and told her she could call anytime she wanted to chat. Lila and I have spoken 3 more times since that initial call. She tells me about school projects, friendship drama, and her thoughts about high school, which she'll be starting next year. I tell her about my art classes, book club discussions, and hiking adventures. We're building the kind of relationship I always hoped to have with my granddaughters. One based on genuine interest in each other's lives, rather than obligation or manipulation. David hasn't contacted me about Lila's calls, which suggests he either doesn't know about them or doesn't object to them as long as they don't involve me demanding more access to his family. I suspect Lila is old enough now to manage her own relationships to some degree, and smart enough to recognize that the distance between her grandmother and parents is artificial rather than necessary. Through my conversations with Lila, I've learned that David and Jessica's life continues much as it did when I was more involved. They're successful, busy, and focused on providing opportunities for the girls. Jessica's parents remain heavily involved in family activities and decisions. David has received another promotion at work, and they've completed the kitchen renovation without my financial assistance. In other words, David's life has been minimally affected by my withdrawal from our relationship. He has plenty of support, both emotional and financial, from other sources. My stepping back created space that was easily filled by people who were better suited to provide what he needed. This realization has helped me understand that my relationship with David was always more important to me than it was to him. I needed to feel needed by him. He needed practical assistance that could come from various sources. When I stopped providing financial help, he replaced me with other forms of support and moved on without significant distress. This understanding is both painful and liberating. Painful because it confirms that I was more invested in our relationship than he was. Liberating because it means my withdrawal from his life isn't causing him significant hardship. He's fine without me, which means I can be fine without him too. The guilt that initially accompanied my decision to establish boundaries has largely disappeared. I'm not punishing David or depriving him of something essential to his well-being. I'm simply refusing to participate in a relationship that was fundamentally unbalanced and ultimately harmful to my own well-being. Last week, I had lunch with Helen from book club, and she asked me if I ever regretted setting boundaries with David. "Don't you miss being involved in his life?" she asked. "Don't you wonder what you're missing with your granddaughters?" I told Helen that I miss the relationship I thought I had with David, but I don't miss the reality of what that relationship actually was. I miss the illusion of being valued and appreciated, but I don't miss the constant anxiety about money, the exclusion from family events, or the feeling that I had to prove my worth through sacrifice. As for my granddaughters, I told Helen that I grieved the limited relationship I have with them. But I also recognized that the access I had before wasn't meaningful. It was supervised, controlled, and designed to serve David and Jessica's needs rather than to foster genuine connection between generations. My phone conversations with Lila have already given me more authentic relationship with her than I had during years of brief, chaperoned visits. Emma is still too young to initiate independent contact, but perhaps someday she'll be curious enough about her grandmother to reach out on her own. If that day never comes, I'll be sad, but not devastated. I've learned to find fulfillment through relationships that reciprocate my investment, rather than waiting for people to value me who have already demonstrated they don't. Helen nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like you've learned to love yourself as much as you love your family. She was right. For the first time in my adult life, I'm treating myself with the same care and consideration I always showed David. I'm protecting my resources, honoring my needs, and requiring respect in my relationships. I'm spending time with people who add joy to my life, rather than people who only contact me when they need something. This shift has been transformative not just psychologically, but physically as well. I sleep better than I have in years, no longer lying awake worrying about David's problems or calculating how to afford his latest request. I have more energy for activities I enjoy because I'm not constantly drained by one-sided emotional labor. I feel lighter, more optimistic, more present in my daily experiences. Today, as I sit in my apartment looking out at the Manhattan skyline I've called home for decades, I feel something I never expected to experience at 76. Excitement about the future. Not because I'm hoping for changes in my relationship with David, but because I'm finally living an authentic life aligned with my own values and priorities. Tomorrow, Frank and I are driving to the Hudson Valley to visit an art museum and have dinner at a restaurant with outdoor seating overlooking the river. Next week, I'm starting a memoir writing class at the community center. Next month, Rosa and I are planning a long weekend in Vermont to see the fall foliage. These are simple pleasures, not grand adventures. But they represent something profound, the freedom to make choices based on my own desires rather than other people's needs. The permission to invest in my own happiness rather than sacrificing endlessly for others' comfort. The recognition that I deserve care, attention, and consideration from the people in my life. I spent 43 years believing that love meant disappearing, making myself smaller so others could be bigger, giving away my resources so others could be more comfortable, accepting exclusion so others wouldn't be inconvenienced by my needs and feelings. I've learned that real love requires presence, not absence. It asks us to show up authentically in our relationships, to contribute our unique perspectives and experiences, to expect reciprocity and mutual consideration. The people who truly love me, Frank, Helen, Rosa, Carmen, Lila, want me present in their lives. They're interested in my thoughts and opinions. They remember what I tell them and ask follow-up questions. They include me in their plans and consider my preferences when making decisions that affect me. These relationships have taught me what I was missing in my connection with David. He wanted me available, but not present, helpful, but not included, generous, but not acknowledged. He loved what I could do for him, but he never learned to love who I was as a person, independent of my utility to his life. That failure is his loss as much as mine. He missed the opportunity to know an intelligent, caring, interesting woman who could have enriched his life in ways beyond financial support. He chose transaction over relationship, utility over connection, convenience over authentic love. But I can't control David's choices. I can only control my own. And I choose to spend my remaining years surrounded by people who celebrate my presence rather than merely tolerate it, who value my contributions rather than simply expect them, who offer their own gifts of attention and care rather than only taking mine. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that stepping back from David would lead to the happiest period of my adult life, I wouldn't have believed them. I thought that being needed by him was the only purpose that gave my life meaning, that supporting his success was the only legacy that mattered. Now I understand that my legacy isn't what I gave to David. It's what I learned about dignity, self-respect, and authentic relationships. My success isn't measured by his achievements. It's measured by how fully I've lived my own life. I raised a son who is successful, educated, and capable of taking care of himself and his family. That success is something we achieved together. His efforts combined with my support. But his character, his values, and his choices about how to treat people are his own responsibility. I'm proud of the mother I was during David's childhood and young adulthood. I gave him every opportunity I could afford, and many I couldn't. I loved him unconditionally and supported his dreams even when they seemed impossible. I sacrificed my own comfort and security to ensure he had every advantage I could provide. But I'm even more proud of the woman I've become since stepping back from our relationship. I've learned to value myself appropriately, to require respect in my interactions, and to invest my energy in connections that honor my worth. I've discovered that I'm more interesting, capable, and resilient than I realized during the years when my entire identity was wrapped up in being David's mother. I have talents and interests that exist independently of my role in his life. I have wisdom and experience that can benefit other people besides my son. I have love to give that can create meaningful connections with people who appreciate receiving it. At 76, I'm finally learning who Margaret is when she's not trying to be everything to everyone else. And I like the woman I'm discovering. If David ever decides he wants to meet this woman, really meet her, not just utilize her, I'll be here. But I won't be waiting for that day or organizing my life around that possibility. I'm too busy living. Have you ever felt like you were giving everything to people who took it for granted? Have you ever loved someone so much that you forgot to love yourself? Have you ever realized that the person you were trying so hard to please didn't actually value your efforts? If my story resonates with you, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Sometimes we feel alone in our struggles, but connection comes from recognizing that others have walked similar paths. And if this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these deeply personal experiences, and perhaps my journey toward self-respect can inspire someone else to begin their own. Thank you for listening, and remember, you deserve to be loved for who you are, not just for what you can give.